President Peter, fellow Rotarians and guests, it is my pleasure today to introduce to you Emeritus Professor Dean Jaensch, who will be addressing us on a most topical topic. So I know you haven't come here to hear me talk, but I shall now ask Dean Jaensch to address you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I must start with an apology because I'm about to ruin a very pleasant lunch. The reason I'm about to ruin it is that I've taken a specific topic for this short address, and that is what's wrong with Australian politics. And that is the last laugh you're going to have, because the answer, in the shortest possible way, is damn near everything. But I'm not going to get away with that. So what I want to do is outline some of the areas of Australian politics that I think are in a bad way. Then, after about 20 minutes of me, if not a bit longer, what I'll do is ask you a question. Then I'll pass it over to you for any questions you might have for me, and I'm happy to elaborate on anything I raise in this brief address. So I'm going to go through a list of things and give you the headlines only, and they're all related to that overall question, what's wrong with Australian politics? First of all, if we start at the beginning of politics, the basic area, and that is our electoral system. We have an electoral system which produced an election of a disparate bunch of misfits in the Australian Senate. And it produced that with some of them winning with a minuscule vote, 1%, 1.3%. And on that, they were elevated to an 8-year term in the Senate. Two of them have already resigned from the parties under whose label they were elected. So when I use disparate and oddball, I mean it. Secondly, we have an election system which in South Australia produced 53% for the Liberal Party, which now finds itself in opposition. Now, there's something wrong with any system that does that. Now, of course, I've got the answers to all of these questions, but I don't have the time to tell you the answers, so I'm going to have fun just giving you the questions. Let's turn to political parties. We have political parties, not just political parties, but major political parties, the ones who at any time may have the numbers to form a government, which have a minuscule membership. Their base is so small that it's very difficult to justify saying these are parties which represent and speak for Australians. If you add together the membership of the Labor, Liberal, National and minor parties, and the National, I mentioned Nationals, and the Greens, you will probably come to a number that is still less than the membership base of Collingwood. Now, that is a worry in itself, because I've never been a Collingwood supporter. We have a Labor Party which is owned and controlled by the trade union movement. Now, there's nothing in theory wrong with that. But the affiliated trade union membership, which controls the Labor Party, is based on a total of 13% of the employed workforce in the private sector. Now, it's difficult to say that that is a basis of majority viewpoint. So maybe there's a question to be asked about that as well. We have political parties which have a regressive gene pool. Now let me explain that. If you want to win a seat, especially a safe seat, in any Australian parliament for the Labor or Liberal parties, what you have to be is a staffer, a minder, a faction heavy, a union leader, or a party apparatchik. If you have any of those qualifications, your opportunities to be pre-selected for a seat, especially a safe seat, for one of the major parties is pretty well lifted up. Where is the breadth of representation? Where's the broad church? You know, the people I'm talking about, the staffers, the minders, the faction heavies and the union leaders and the apparatchiks, they're people who've never had a real job. Never. They've spent their entire professional life in that narrow coterie called party or faction or union or whatever. So we don't have that breadth of representation. And I think it is a regressive gene pool. It is not encouraging other people to put their names forward to stand for pre-selection in political parties and hence eventually join the Australian Parliament or the South Australian Parliament. We have political parties whose members have been shown to be deeply corrupt. I'll just mention Obeid and McDonald in New South Wales. That is deep corruption. We have 12 Liberal members of the New South Wales Parliament. Their party passed a law which said to accept electoral donations from property developers is illegal. They voted for it. They passed that law through the Parliament. 12 of them then went ahead and broke the law. Now, how do we interpret that? 12 members of the Liberal Party wrote the law and then broke it. One of them, in fact, lied to the ICAC hearing about it. I mean, where are the ethics? Where's the morality in politics today? I'm not suggesting every politician is like that, but where you find those two nests of absolute corruption within one state, then, and you think back to what happened in Queensland, and you think back to the reason why we now have so many ICACs throughout Australia, ranging the Fitzgerald Commission in Queensland. And remember, the Fitzgerald Commission established corruption at the top. The Commissioner of Police was jailed for corruption. Then what can we expect from our politicians? We in Australia have parliaments that, when they're in session, are essentially medieval bear pits. Have you ever taken the time to listen to Question Time on the ABC lately? Look, I know we're all busy people and we all have things to do, but just take the time one day when Parliament is sitting in Canberra to tune in on the ABC, no, News Radio, and listen to Question Time. It is an eye-opener, because medieval bear pit, I think, is an accurate description of what we have in our parliaments. We had the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd governments, which malfunctioned in almost every possible way. Policy making, policy application, policy administration, just the simple issues of trying to run an efficient cabinet malfunctioned in almost every possible way. Now we have a Rudd government. No. Take it back. Take that off the tape, please. We have an Abbott government which refused to learn a lesson. It has made the great mistake of not learning lessons. The carbon tax promise, which was broken by Julia Gillard, was fatal for her. Over the next 3 years, the Australian voters did not give her any respite, nor should they. A broken promise, not only just a promise, but a promise couched in these words: there will not be a carbon tax under any government I lead. That's strong. And to break it almost immediately after the election, I think made Australian voters lose faith, not only in Julia Gillard, but in the system. And there's no doubt at all, it ranks almost up with that famous promise made by Paul Keating when he said the tax cuts are LAW law until after the election, when they were cancelled. And a similar thing happened to Paul Keating. He was defeated in the next election. Tony Abbott did not learn this lesson. On the eve of the federal election in 2013, he made a series of promises. One of them was that there would be no cuts to the ABC or to SBS. Now, you've all seen the reaction now that there have been savage cuts. It's a lesson which, if not learnt, leads towards a defeat at the next election. One thing Tony Abbott has done is learnt a lesson from his period in opposition, because the Abbott coalition opposition was almost totally negative. It set as its aim destroying the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd governments, and it succeeded. But it was a negative emphasis. Bill Shorten has learnt a lesson because he is now running one of the most negative oppositions I think I've seen in years. It worked for Abbott in 2013. The question is, will it work for Shorten at the next election? I find it appalling the way we, the voters, are given nothing but negativism, nothing about real policies, alternatives from opposition, because that surely is their task. Let me turn to one other component. The public service is one of the great jewels in the crown for any British system of government, because what it does is allow advice to be given to governments by heads of the public service on a frank and free, let's call it frank and fearless way. The task of a head of department in a Westminster public service is to give frank and fearless advice to government. Not to give government what the government wants to hear, but to give government advice which is necessary for that government to act in a proper way. Until the Hawke government, that was the case in Australia. Heads of departments had permanent tenure. They were permanent appointments. They could give frank and fearless advice. Hawke changed the rules of the Westminster system and he put heads of departments on contracts. As soon as that's done, it's the end of the frank and fearless advice. What head of department is going to give fearless advice to a government against what the government wants to do at a time when that head of department is under a contract? Nobody. So the public service concept, which was embedded in Australia, the Westminster system, is now gone. We have a federal system which in 1901 was absolutely necessary for the existence of Australia, because South Australia, Western Australia, Tasmania were scared of domination by Canberra, which didn't exist then, Melbourne and Sydney. They wanted a constitution which would be federal and which would grant protection for the states. They received that constitution, so it was necessary in 1901. I would describe the current federal system as perhaps the biggest hindrance to effective and efficient policy making and application in Australia's history. The federal system involves triplication, over-government. We have 9 departments of everything. If you think of transport, education, health, and so on, we have 9 separate departments across this country. It is almost impossible to progress good policy when there's the necessity to get agreements from at least two levels of government for that policy to be put into practice. We are over-governed. Let me give you a figure that I think is important. In Britain, there are 650 members of Parliament, and that covers 70 million people. In Australia, we have 22 million people and we have 824 members of Parliament. Do we need them all? Could we do with less? Certainly, if you look at the way policy is made, a lot of it is made in the Council of Australian Governments, commonly known as COAG. And COAG only progresses when there is agreement between the states and the local government, which is represented on COAG, and the federal government. And that happens very rarely. And when it does happen, it takes years to get there. So how has Australia progressed in economic terms, in social terms? Why have we kept progressing forward? Well, one reason for it is the High Court. The High Court, when asked to make decisions in conflicts between state and federal governments, have made sensible and logical decisions. Decisions such as our industrial system. The Franklin Dam was decided by the High Court. But it really isn't the job of a High Court to make such policies or allow policies to be put forward. And essentially, one of the problems we have is because we're federal, we have a constitution. That constitution was written in and for the year 1897. It is still virtually unchanged. We've had 44 referendum questions put to the people. The people have said yes to 8. Most of them were motherhood issues, like should judges retire at 70, and nobody's going to vote against that. But on the other issues, with substantive change put to the people, we've tended to vote no. So what we have is an outdated, anachronistic constitution. It's a constitution which often, if you wish to progress Australia, you have to somehow ignore. And the classic case of that is the Snowy River scheme. Now, we all know the Snowy scheme. It's one of the wonders of the world. Did you know it's illegal? The chief engineer of the Snowy scheme wrote a book after it was finished. He said the thing they feared most was not the dams breaking or the pipes exploding. It was that some idiot would take a case to the High Court and the High Court would have to close the whole thing down. Because the Constitution specifically denies the federal government any power when it comes to water supply. The CSIRO is similar. The CSIRO only exists because governments ignored the Constitution. So maybe it's time we need a new Constitution. We have a public in Australia which is arguably the most apathetic in the Western democratic world. Apathy rules supreme. My view is that if we're going to have a good democratic public, it needs to be informed about politics, it needs to be interested in politics, it needs to be motivated to find out more things, it needs to be open-minded about politics, and it needs to be discussive about politics. Now, all of those are prerequisites if we're going to have the people making decisions not only about those they elect to parliaments, but the policies which should be at the forefront of the minds of those we elect to parliaments. But what does research show about the average Australian voter? None of you, no, I'm not mentioning you, no, none of you are here. Put aside any thought that I'm talking about you, I'm not. Because I know you're all open-minded, rational, thinking, intelligent people. But in the main, the average Australian voter has no knowledge about politics. One of my colleagues simply calls them a vacuum tube. They know nothing about politics at all, and yet they're voting. They have no interest in politics. They have behind their forehead a tattoo called Labor or Liberal, and they work on the assumption that my party, right or wrong. I will always vote for my party. I don't know anything about its policies or its people or its candidates or anything else, but I like the label. Now, going a step further, they're not open-minded, they're not informed, they're not rational, they're apathetic. But one of the big problems is they're not discussive. They don't like talking about politics. If I find myself in America or Canada or Europe and start a conversation about politics, I'll have trouble getting away because they love talking about politics. In Australia, when I was being brought up, there were 3 topics my parents told me I should never raise in public: politics, sex and religion. These days there's only one, and that's politics. Now, if you don't believe me, try a little experiment. I do this constantly. I travel a lot on public transport because of my age and condition, and I sit down next to a total stranger and I start talking politics. I've had people move to another seat. I've never yet had a discussion. Now, in a way, our democratic society can live with apathy, and that put all of those together and you get the grab bag called apathy. I think we can live with it. It's not really dangerous. It could be better, but it's not dangerous. What worries me, and this is my what's wrong with politics again, is that apathy is turning to cynicism. Australian voters are becoming not just apathetic, but cynical about politics. And I would argue very strongly that cynicism is the cancer of democracy. Once people become cynical, it's very hard to bring them back in terms of supporting the political life of the country. And they are becoming cynical. I saw some material from the Electoral Commission that showed that something like 30% of 18 to 24-year-olds don't intend to enrol to vote. Don't intend to enrol. And when asked, the answers can be put under the heading cynicism. What's in it for me? What have they done for me? They're all interested in themselves. Now, this is scary. We have a political system which is increasingly distrusted by the electorate. The latest data I saw by a reputable survey organisation came up with this data. 27% of the respondents said government can be trusted. 27% trusted the government. 73% said they didn't trust the government. Now, if that doesn't scare you, it scares me. So that's where I'm about to stop, which will leave 15 minutes for questions and arguments, preferably arguments. I love arguments. And I've yet to lose one. The question I want to put to you before I turn to your questions is, given that list of criteria which define what's wrong with Australian politics, and I have many more I could mention, given the fact that you are leaders in your fields and have an influence on other people, what are you going to do about it? Does it worry you? And if so, what do you think you can do about it to reverse the trends I've enunciated? Now, as I said, I apologise for ruining an excellent lunch. And now I pass it over to you for questions, comments and arguments. Thank you for listening. Don't worry, I'll handle them.
Thank you very much indeed, Dean. And now we have time for a few questions, and I'm sure we'll... So, Eric.
Could I ask you to be against what steps would have to be taken by state and federal governments to change the electoral system so that its minority parties
Sitting on our table there is probably an expert in this field, better than mine. But let me give you an answer to that. I think there are serious problems with our electoral system. And I have a long list of an agenda that I think would reform them. The first one I'd suggest is, why do we retain compulsory voting? Why do we compel people to vote? Now, I know there's a ruling, judicial ruling, that says voting does, you can vote without marking the ballot paper, but I find that utterly illogical. To me, voting means marking the ballot paper. So here you have a law in the Electoral Act that says voting is compulsory, and if I define voting as marking the ballot paper, which I think makes sense, then here is a law that cannot be taken to court because it can't be proved. Voting is secret. Who can ever know how you voted or whether you voted? So in this case, the law is an ass, but put that one aside. I would like to see optional preferential voting instead of compulsory preferences. If I have 5 candidates on my ballot paper, then I'll make every effort I can to find out about those 5 candidates. And I might decide to myself, there's 2 I'd be happy to have elected to Parliament. Those 2. The other 3 I wouldn't feed. So why do I have to put preferences by them all? I have to give a preference even to those 3 who I reject totally as representatives of me. I would like to see the abolition of how to vote cards. Why do we depend on how to vote cards to make decisions which we should be making? Why do the majority of Australians simply and blindly follow a how to vote card? They don't in Tasmania because there's no how to vote cards down there. So despite our occasional thoughts that Tasmanians are people who can't walk and chew gum at the same time, Tasmanians are the most politically and electorally educated in the whole nation because they have to be to work out their electoral system, to understand it and to make it work. I can give you another number of other reasons, but I would also like to see what's called truth in political advertising. Now, those of you in business know full well that if you sell an item which is not what the package states it is, there's things like Consumer Protection Authorities, Trade Practices Act, which will bring you into line very quickly. Not in politics. There was an attempt in 1984 to modify the Electoral Act to include these words, and I'm paraphrasing. It shall be an electoral offence if any person publishes any material which is false or may mislead the voter. Guess what happened when Parliament got hold of that clause? Labor, Liberal and National voted together to delete it. So it is still open go for lying in election campaigns. But I'd now come back to you. If we have optional preferential voting, and if we get rid of this abomination called above-the-line voting, then I think we'll secure what you want. If you vote above the line, and 96% of Australians do so, what you are doing is saying to the party of your choice, here are my preferences, do what you like with them. So let's get rid of above-the-line voting, require that people only put a number of preferences up to the number of vacant seats. So in the Senate, you'd have to vote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you wanted to go any further, it'll be your choice. That will deal with these minor parties very quickly.
Thank you very much.
Phil. Yeah.
Dean, I enjoyed the speech, and I know you work in the university environment. What are the prospects of you delivering that very same speech on our unbiased ABC? Because I would like to hear your views nationally expressed. I think Australians of my generation need to sit back and rethink the whole process, because I think it's finished myself. And I'd love to hear you on the ABC. Is there anything we can do to get you there to present your views?
I've already done it 35 times on the ABC. I have tried to get well, I'll put it another way. For the last 40 years, I have been constantly involved in what I call public political education, because I think that's part of my job, or part of my retirement. And I've been spending an inordinate amount of time talking to groups, ranges of groups, about exactly what I've talked about today. Not so blatant as I've given you, but I've certainly raised these issues with the purpose, and the purpose of my speech today is one thing only, and it's what I try to do over 40 years, and that is to give people an opportunity to think about politics, to actually think about it, to go home tonight with a port, coffee, red, whatever it is you like, and just think about, yeah, that does need to be changed and modified. What can I do to help modify it? But after 40 years, I'm convinced I'm a total and utter failure. Wherever I go, the Australian public still looks the same, sounds the same. But yeah, I know what I've said today, I've said in numerous other places. It's because it's something I firmly believe in. I think I've got a great faith in Australia's democracy. I'm proud of Australia's democracy. But I can see it being eroded daily, and I'm unhappy about that. That's why I give talks like this. Sir.
Yeah. Yes, John.
Students are revolting because the picking government want to inspect their candidates for election in the forthcoming election. Do you think we could write that in and ask them to send a delegation to inspect our Senate candidates?
There's 2 points I'd like to take up from that. The first is that I'm fully aware that despite all the complaints I have, despite all this list of things that's wrong with Australian politics, that countries like Zimbabwe, people like Hong Kong voters, people in countries in Africa would dearly love a system like ours. I mean, we should be proud of what we've got. My argument is that instead of getting better, it's getting worse. So I have no doubt at all that there are many parts of the world that would take what we've got as a system and have it immediately and feel happy about it. But in terms of sending out any sort of committee to vet our candidates, I would suggest no, under any circumstances, because what that would do is take away the responsibility of each individual voter to make his or her minds up about who do they want to represent them in Parliament. So having a committee do that, I mean, the political parties have that committee already. It's called pre-selection. If you want to be a candidate for Labor or Liberal or Greens or whatever, then you go through an ordeal, and that is trying to win pre-selection. So they're being vetted by their party. But as for any committee vetting candidates on behalf of the voters, I think that takes away the ultimate responsibility of each individual voter.
Yes, John.
Sir, you may remember the cargo hold just after the Second World War. It appears that in Australia, that we have this cargo hold today. It appears that one party, particularly over the last few years, had been giving handout after handout, virtually buying votes. It's virtually graft. Would you care to comment on that, please, sir?
I mean, if that's the case, why do they get away with it? How come they continually get away with it? Because we, the voters, are happy with it.
Yes, but we won't be handed out. You won't vote unless they hand it out.
Well, who's at fault? The answer is we are. No, I think there's a solution to a lot of these problems, and that is that in America, every child leaving school has a full knowledge of American politics. There are courses in American schools which teach children the Constitution, the parties, the policies, the history, etc. Kids leave school in America full bottle about politics. In Australia, we don't. So our youth go into voting age with no background, except unless they get it from their parents, no background of knowledge, information, awareness, open-mindedness about politics. I think we need politics taught in schools from year 8 to 12 as a compulsory core subject. Because otherwise we're depending on a myth. And the myth is this. Say you have a girl, a daughter, who's 17 years and 364 days old. She goes to bed tonight knowing that tomorrow's her birthday, she'll be 18. Do we assume, and I think we do, that at midnight there's a flash of lightning from the sky that gets into her brain and teaches her all about politics? No, it doesn't happen. I'll tell you an anecdote. We formed many years ago a committee for the teaching of politics. We wanted politics taught in schools. It took us 10 years to get it allowed to be taught in Year 12. So it's now taught in Year 12 schools and a watered down one in some Year 11 classes. It took us 10 years. And it was a hell of a battle to get it through. Who do you think opposed us vehemently and strongly and completely? It wasn't the teachers, they wanted it taught. It wasn't the principals, they wanted it taught. It wasn't the parliament, the parties were quite happy with it. The opposition came from parents. The parents did not want little Johnny or little Joan coming home and knowing more about politics than they did. Or this is worse, coming home and hearing positive things about the party they abhorred. So that's where the problem came, the parents. So I'm back to where I am. What do we do about the public? Well, one way to do it is to declare that anybody over the age of 14 is lost and start putting some efforts into educating the next generation, and that's where I think it should be.
The last question from our President Peter.
No, that's all right. I think we're out of time, I think.
Okay, right.
Oh, no.
Well, thank you.
We can talk afterwards.
Yeah, I hope so.
Well, thank you, Dean, indeed, for that address today. Very, very good indeed.
Thank you.
And there's a bit of light reading material about Rotary.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And good luck.
Yeah.